Congress sucks. Hey everybody, my name is Joe Bob and this is Barely Paying Attention. Today we're going to be talking about Congress and why it totally sucks. But before we dive in, I want to quickly outline what this show is going to be and its purpose. I don't know if you've noticed this, but the political world has gone crazy. Nobody's shy about sharing their feelings and or opinions on any given political topic, regardless of whether or not they actually have any idea what's going on. Politics is just trendy now. And while it's the hot topic of conversation, people still tend to know more about Kanye's relationship status than they do about the political game. And honestly, that's okay. It's probably encouraged. The big political story of the day generally doesn't really have any effect on your day-to-day life. We really shouldn't be paying second-to-second attention to what's going on in the political world. It's not healthy. It's like you're on a 9-hour trip to grandma's and your kids keep asking, "Are we there yet?" every 5 minutes. You're bound to go insane. Instead, we should all try cutting out the day-to-day partisan bickering because the majority of it does not matter. However, we should also stay informed enough to positively contribute to our political process. Right now, there seems to be two groups of people. Those who notice every time Ted Cruz colors the gray hairs on his beard, and those who are so stoked to see him in the next Mission Impossible. So that's the gap this show is trying to fill. We'll dig a little deeper than the surface level that you might see on cable or evening news, and try to gear it specifically towards those of us who are barely paying attention. With that, let's get into our first topic, Congress, how it works and why it's not working. Currently, Congress has about a 9% approval rating. Yeah, 9%. To put that in perspective, here's a list of things that people approve of more than Congress. Star Wars: The Last Jedi, the McPizza, and violence. More people believe Jeffrey Epstein killed himself than approve of the job Congress is currently doing. But while its approval rating is insanely low, one of the key components to understanding everything else going on is to understand the function of Congress. Now, I don't want to assume anyone's understanding of what Congress does, so briefly, Congress is made up of two parts. First, the House of Representatives, which is 435 members with roughly equal representation based on population. For example, a small state like Delaware only has one representative, while a state like California with a huge population have more representatives than Buffalo Wild Wings has flavors. With that, the 435 representatives of the House are the kind of members that are going to pull the political stunts to get attention like this.
Trying to scare everybody.
Will the gentleman yield?
No, I will not yield to this monkey court or whatever this thing is.
This is not a monkey court.
Do whatever you want. I'm not yielding.
There's a lot of clowns in the House. The other side is the Senate, which is made up of 100 senators, 2 from each state. The U.S. Senate is known to be the greatest deliberative body on the planet. Unlike the House, which requires a simple majority to pass legislation, the Senate currently needs 60 votes to move a bill forward. This has made the Senate the legislative check on some of the crazier bills that can get through the House. However, unfortunately, the Senate is becoming more and more of a circus in the past couple of years, taking after their counterparts in the House.
On the nomination of
Mr.
Judge
Chairman.
Brett Kavanaugh
Mr. Chairman.
to serve as Associate Justice.
Mr. Chairman,
on the
I'd like to be
Supreme Court of
recognized
the
for a
United
question
States.
before we proceed.
I know this is an exciting day for all of you here, and you're rightly proud
Mr. Chairman,
of Judge.
if we cannot be recognized, I move to adjourn.
The American people.
Mr. Chairman, I move
get
to adjourn.
hear directly.
Now, I can come up with a laundry list of specifics as to why the collective Congress is doing such a bad job. But instead, I want to give an overview of what Congress is supposed to do, why they're not doing it, and what implications that has. Ideally, after this, you'll look at Congress kind of like you look at your neighbor who just painted their house light purple. You hate it, and every single day you think of ways to get them to move. As an example, let's take a look at some of the recent wars the US has been involved in and how it's changed Congress. Wars are kind of like Kim Kardashian's butt, big and expensive. And for the past half century, it's been difficult to find a definitive end to any of the so-called wars we've been involved in. The president is the commander-in-chief of the military, but it's up to Congress to actually declare war. That means that Congress members must vote on whether or not the United States should or should not go to war. And that's all fine. But remember, wars are expensive in both US lives and cash. That means war comes with a lot of scrutiny, and when it's all said and done, the voters usually have a pretty good sense of whether or not going to war was a good idea or a bad idea. The American people then hold Congress members accountable depending on how they voted. In other words, if the war turned out to be a bad idea, the members of Congress who voted for it run the risk of losing their next election. And they hate losing elections. Congress hates losing elections almost as much as we hate this guy. But overall, this is a good thing. It's democracy at work. We hold our elected officials accountable when they make bad decisions by not re-electing them. That's how it's supposed to work. However, those sneaky politicians in Congress have found a workaround. If they never vote for anything consequential, they'll never be held to account for those votes. You remember when the last time Congress actually declared war was? Afghanistan? No. Iraq? No. The war on TikTok? Unfortunately, no. It wasn't Desert Storm, not Korea, it wasn't even Vietnam. World War II was the last time the US Congress voted to declare war. Of course, you may be asking, well, what in the world are we doing in all those other places? Well, friends, that's called congressionally approved military engagement. In other words, instead of putting their neck on the line and taking responsibility for their choices, Congress found a workaround so they don't ever have to commit. It's like your girlfriend who keeps pestering you to get married, and your response is, absolutely, sweetheart. Unfortunately, I can only approve of moving in, raising kids, and growing old together. The problem with this mentality is it's clearly spread to many other responsibilities of Congress. Instead of taking hardline positions on difficult issues, which is the exact reason we sent them to DC in the first place, they pass these vague, feel-good bills and kick the can of responsibility down the road. That way, they don't have to take responsibility if things go south. Congress doesn't create concrete laws anymore. They're too scared to lose re-election. They really don't make any decisions anymore. It's kind of like when you ask your wife where she wants to go for dinner. Except for when Congress fails to make a decision, I won't starve. Now, I could get into some specific instances of Congress having passed broad and vague laws. Healthcare policy is a great example of this. But for the sake of time and the fact that unpacking healthcare policy will be an entire episode in the future, I think it's best to just stick with a hypothetical. Let's just say Congress proposes the nothing bad should happen to anyone bill. Nobody can be against that. What are you, pro bad things happening? Of course not. So the bill becomes law. Then what? Basically, Congress passed a bill that eliminates all bad things, whatever that means. They then throw it to the appointed bureaucrats of the government agencies and say, you figure out how to make that happen. And who generally appoints these government bureaucrats? These guys. Now it's up to the people appointed by the president to figure out, one, what's a bad thing, and two, how do we eliminate it? As you might have guessed, the answer to those questions vary a lot depending on who's being asked. And the problem is that now, instead of having people we sent to Congress craft specific laws, we have unelected government workers appointed by the administration designing rules in order to satisfy the ambiguous objectives of these people.
Mr. Chairman, we have the email. There is no fringe.
Excuse me, it's not your time.
Mr. Jordan, you do not have the time. Please be respectful of your colleague. She controls the time.
Put your mask on. Put your mask on.
Now, broad legislation is only one of the ways Congress doesn't do its job. The other way is easier to explain, but equally as bad. They just don't take on the issue at all. One of the hottest topics in politics is immigration. Every single politician on the Hill uses immigration to rally voters to the polls. But you know how long it's been since Congress passed any meaningful immigration reform? Over 20 years. Yeah, 2000 was the last time Congress passed a bill that had any relevant change to one of the most argued over topics in America. Congressional politicians have been shouting things like, "We need a wall," or "Nobody is illegal," for the last 2 decades, but nobody has done anything about it. Again, rather than get into the weeds of this right now, rest assured we'll do a full episode on immigration policy in the future. Now, if all that sounds stupid, it's because it is. And that was never the way that any of this was intended to work. Congress was supposed to write laws, and the president was supposed to enforce them. But because of the election selfishness of Congress, that's not happening. It's gotten so bad that in 2007, Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia cited the seldom used Vagueness Doctrine in one of his dissents. In constitutional law, a statute is void for vagueness when it's too vague for the average citizen to understand. And while it's only been used a handful of times throughout the entirety of US history, 3 of those times came in the last 10 years. So where does that leave us? If Congress isn't making the rules, who is? Want to know why the presidency has become more important than it was ever intended to be? Like I said, Congress is supposed to write laws. The president and their administration is supposed to enforce them. That's how it's supposed to work. But what happens if, for political reasons, Congress continues to pass vague bills without any specifics or just completely ignores the problem entirely?
President Obama is in Nevada today. He signed 2 executive orders as he flew west on Friday.
President Trump is going to reverse much of former President Barack Obama's environmental protection regulations and executive orders.
President Biden headed into his new office and started signing away Donald Trump's legacy, much like what Donald Trump did to Barack Obama in 2016.
Now, I'm sure you've heard the term executive order by now, but if you haven't, it's a directive issued by the president to manage the operations of the federal government. In the past, executive orders were used to direct federal agencies on how to execute and enforce laws. Say if your roommates took a vote and Jonathan has to do the dishes tonight. In that vote, you tell him that he needs to wash each dish with soap, water, and a sponge until they're clean, and then those dishes need to be dried and put back into the cabinet by 9 p.m. tonight. You've given him explicit rules and parameters, and now it's up to him to take executive action on how to get the job done. Sounds like a plan. However, recently, the past several administrations have taken advantage of Congress's lack of motivation to create concrete laws and used executive order to essentially do whatever they want in a given department. Imagine your roommates took a vote and said that Jonathan has to do the dishes, but didn't give any other specifics. Well, Jonathan, that lazy smart aleck, now has a lot of wiggle room. And after 3 days, when you say, Jonathan, you were supposed to do the dishes, he says, you never said by when. Then you say, Jonathan, you have to do the dishes tonight. He says, well, do you have a quorum? So you get the rest of your roommates together and they vote that Jonathan needs to do the dishes by today. And then he says, define do. And that is how President Jonathan operates his executive branch when given vague instructions. This is how recent presidents see the executive order when coupled with a lack of specific instruction. With a stroke of a pen, the president can and will essentially bypass the entire legislative process, fill the legal gap with what he or she wants to do, and create sweeping changes with regard to federal policy. Because Congress doesn't do its job, one person that half the country didn't vote for can make drastic changes to laws and policies that have an actual effect on everyday life. And to even further compound the problem, in 4 years, those policies can go completely the other direction when a new president is in office. This is no way to run a country. One of the brightest examples of this is immigration policy. As we mentioned before, Congress hasn't done jack in decades with regards to immigration. This gave President Obama room to essentially make up his own immigration policy with executive order. In response to this dictator-like overreach, Congress reacted sternly by doing absolutely nothing, which gave President Trump room to make up his own policy on immigration, again by executive order. And how did Congress respond to this fascist power grab? By doing nothing and allowing President Biden to make up his own rules for immigration. I'd be willing to bet that Congress' reaction will be about the same. And in 2025, President Nikki Haley will make up her own immigration policy. Here's the thing. You may even agree with some of the executive action taken by the president, but that's not the point. The point is that this is not the way the federal government was designed to run. And while you may love some of the ideas any given president is pushing now, the next president may very well do the exact opposite of what you want, unless Congress gets their act together. To wrap things up, if Congress continues to be legislatively indecisive and instead focus their time on being insta-famous, The only thing that happens is we give more and more power to the Oval Office, which I guarantee you would have our founding fathers rolling in their graves. The fight over policy needs to be in Congress. Until then, we, the American people, will be subject to massive changes in federal policy every 4 years. That's our show. For those of you barely paying attention, thanks for doing so. We'll see you next time.